Okay. All right, so we'll get as far as we can get. I'll sit as long as I can sit, and then I'll just stop. So we're going to review 10 a little bit, but then primarily we're going to focus on chapter 11. 10, we're going to just look at forming the verb. Chapter 11, then we'll intro, and pretty much what we'll look at tonight are in your notes. So if you have lesson 11, if you have that in front of you, we'll look at that, introduce a few things. We'll not look at formation of these particular tenses, present, future, and perfect. We'll look at just some introductory materials for them, and then next time we'll look at formation of them. Just a few things before we start, though. One is this. Have 3 charts that I handed out. This one is an old one that we had done it before, but I revised it. So you might want to replace it with the other. And the other thing is, if you want to laminate these, this one and the next one we'll look at. If you want to laminate them, that's great. So essentially, this was the chart of primary tenses: the perfect, the future, the present, the future, and the perfect. And primarily because they share the ending. So across the top, we have the present active indicative, future active indicative, present, middle, and passive indicative, and so on. And then we have the endings down here at the bottom. So what I did was I showed the previous form and then its changes. That's the addition to the notes there. So we have the active voice endings, primary tenses, and then middle and passive voice endings for primary tenses. So if you want to swap the other one out for this one, unless you have notes on the other one, I just thought that it would be helpful to see the variations and why they came in brief summation. So if you want to keep that out, we'll use that tonight. And then the other one is this, per Jerry's request. So I used this chart on the PowerPoint. So I gave you that, and you have reality and then potentiality. And then at the bottom, we have the different forms that are used for these. And so this is for the regular verb. So this will be a chart that we've reviewed and looked at and made reference to. So if you want to laminate this and have it with you, that'll be a good thing. And again, what I did on the bottom for primary tense endings, you'll notice that I put the old form, me, and then I put the changes that happen, and so on. So if you keep this out as well, we'll make reference to this tonight. But again, they're just 2 charts that sort of simplify things. And then when we get into the imperfect, aorist, and pluperfect, then I'll give you a similar chart like this for those. So essentially, you'll have 3 main charts for the verb forms, for the regular verb forms. Then this one, consonant changes. Now, I had given similar diagrams to go with this. Primarily, this is dealing with the perfect tense. And we said with the perfect tense, 2 things that we looked at were the reduplication, the duplicating of the first consonant, right? So reduplication for the perfect, and then the endings. These are changes that happen. We'll look at the middle and passive endings. When you take the middle and passive endings and attach them to the perfect stem, there's going to be change with the consonants because there isn't a connecting vowel. So we'll talk about that tonight. So this chart just shows you examples of the different variations that can happen of what if you have this consonant put to this consonant on a perfect stem, what are the changes that happen? And again, these are just taking us back to our alphabet in our chart there. So this is a little bit easier chart to read from the previous ones I gave you, but so you have appendix for lesson 10. This will be a little bit easier for you to read, and then I give you a whole bunch of examples on the side there. So that's just for that. So, and we'll look more at this chart for next time. But we'll talk about the changes that happen in the endings because we're going to intro middle and passive tonight, and then next time we'll talk about the changes that happen with consonants and how we form it and and that kind of thing. So, all right, so I just have to remember to get every one of these charts. But anyway, so I'm stoked. If you guys, if you think about things, that other charts that I put up that we don't have in hard copy, let me know, and if they'd help you, I'll make copies or come up with a new chart. All right, so we're going to start into lesson 11 tonight, and we'll intro present, future, and perfect, middle, and passive indicatives. And we'll look at the various introductory thoughts with that. Going back a little bit, though, we looked at several things we need to know. Second declension endings. Just remind you of these, sort of keep going over these because we're going to need them when we get to participles, which isn't too far away. So we had the masculine singular, neuter singular endings, and then we had the masculine plural and neuter plural endings for second declension. And then we had first declension endings. We had the variations that came depending on what was at the end of the stem, depending on the consonant that was there and so on. These were changes that happened, but they all share the same plural form. So far, these are the endings that we've had for nouns, which carry over for adjectives and so on. And then we're talking about verb forms. We're going to talk about the tense stems a little bit more tonight. So these are just things that we need to look for. So it's these elements here with the nouns and adjectives that are a concern, and then when we get to the verbs, then it's the tense stems and so on that we need to keep our eyes on, because those are the keys that unlock the doors for us as far as meaning in that. So a little bit of review from lesson 10, the perfect active indicative, and then we'll start into lesson 11. And just to review some things about tense and voice and so on. So when we talk about perfect active indicative, perfect is tense, active is voice, and then indicative is mood. And we'll talk about this a little bit, but the unfortunate, some of the terms that are used to describe things, like voice, the focus isn't on the action, the focus is more on the subject. But then you have active voice and passive voice, and those reflect action. Middle is kind of like a weird designation because it's nothing. But so we have this active voice, passive voice, so it can be misleading as far as what voice is really talking about. Tense looks at the kind of action, voice looks at the subject, the one doing it, and their relationship to that. So just keep that in mind as we walk through this. These are just English designations put to things. And the reason why I bring that up, because we'll talk about middle voice and passive voice. Middle voice is something really foreign to us in English. It's really hard to capture the Greek middle voice into English translation. So sometimes we can find it by way of reflexive pronouns and things like that in English trying to carry over, but we miss a lot of it. I mean, we looked at Ephesians 1:4. He chose us. Really, he chose us for himself. He had an invested interest in that. But it just, translations are he chose us. It's really simple. It's flat. It's lifeless, right? We can sort of get a sense of that there's an intended relationship when he moves into verse 5, unto adoption as sons and so on. But there's still so much in the verb there, and especially there because that's the only finite verb in that whole section, 3 through 14 of chapter 1. Everything else, the rest are participles that hinge off of that. So just to say, when we get into the middle voice, this is where we have to, again, reorient our mind to think more like a Greek and less like an American, a Western mindset, as hard as that may be. But the more that we can do that, the better off we'll be. So again, if we can just sort of put aside even the designations, present, that kind of thing, if we can put those things aside, try to get a grasp of where the mindset is behind the language, and that will help us down the line, not only with translation, but interpreting and understanding the significance of what's being brought out. So forming a Greek verb, by way of review, we talked about there's several elements that are involved in forming the Greek verb. First, we have the verb stem, and this is the simple form of the verb. The simplest is the root. That's taking us back to the triliteral root that, like luo, lu is the root. In that case, it's biliteral. So root is taking us back to the basics, right? The very basics. Stem is then a little bit further developed. So usually what we find in our Greek dictionaries and lexicons is we'll find what we would call the stem. We have like lambano, but the root is lob, right? You'll find lambano, you won't find lob, but you'll learn that over time. So just to sort of make the distinction a little bit in your own mind, it will help you in grasping things. Then, so we had this case with lambano, and here it has an infix because it's la, but then we put the nasal infix mu, right, because of the beta. So we put the mu there, lambano, and we've talked about the different ways in which we can form off of the root the different, either it's the noun or the verb or so on, but basically we're talking about verbs as just the verb stem. Then we have the tense stem, and this is the form of the verb employed to distinguish the tense. So these are things that we're going to look for. These are just those keys that unlock the doors. So we know that when we're talking about future, we're looking for that sigma. And we'll see that all the way through, whether it's the active or the middle and passive. And it's interesting is that you'll see with the future, middle, and future passive, they share the same endings, my, sci, ti, meth, but there's, for the passive you have theta, eta. For the middle you don't have that. But you'll still always find the sigma. So whether it's future active, future middle, future passive, you'll always find that sigma. So if you look on your let's take this one out, the primary tense. So if you look across the top there, so look at future active indicative, which is the second one to the right, and then we have the sigma in the red there, right? Luso, luseis, lusei, lusamen, lusete, lususi. So if you move to the right then, over to the future middle indicative, notice we have our middle and passive endings, my, sci, ti, metha, essa, nti. But notice we have the sigma, and then we have the connecting vowel between the ending and the verb stem, or in this case, the verb root. So notice then, if we move from future middle indicative, go to the right one more, future passive indicative. Okay? So notice, same endings, my, sci, ti, metha, essa, nti. So exact same endings as the middle, future middle. But there's the theta, eta. That tells us it's future passive. Okay? But notice the sigma. It's still there. So whether you have future active, future middle, future passive, you're always going to have that sigma. Okay? But when we learn the future passive, you'll learn that also look for the theta, eta plus the middle and passive endings. So that's the thing to keep in mind. So then when we come to aorist then, we have sigma alpha, and that will be the thing that we look for. Now, that doesn't mean that there aren't other forms. There's going to be forms where they have a kappa, but for the most part, this is what we're looking for, regular verbs, sigma alpha. And with the aorist, you're going to have an augment on the front, which would be the epsilon, right, essentially, and then you have the sigma alpha. So those are two things that you'll look for. Just like with the perfect, you're going to look for reduplication and then look for the kappa, right, for the active. So sigma alpha for the aorist, and then for the perfect is the kappa. Now I would say kappa alpha because it takes a different connecting vowel, and essentially the alpha is the connecting vowel here. But if you notice on your chart then, for the perfect active and the perfect middle and passive, we have reduplication, but for the perfect active we're going to find the kappa. Middle and passive, we're not going to have that, and we're not even going to have a connecting vowel. For the perfect middle and passive indicative, we're just going to have my, sci, ti, metha, essa, nti put to the stem. Okay? So we'll, again, next time we'll look at those things and talk a little bit more in detail. But just so you notice then, so perfect active, we're looking for the kappa or the kappa alpha, and the middle and passive, we'll look for the middle passive endings, but also the reduplication. So those are just things that we're looking for. So if we can learn the elements, so when we get to participles, same thing. We'll learn the elements that are used to make the participles. All we have to do is just know those, right? And then we can designate those and draw those parts out and figure out what's going on instead of memorizing over and over all the lists. Just learn the little keys that sort of unlock the doors for us. So basically it is to take future active indicative, we can make it off present active indicative. All we do is just add the sigma. And we looked at what happens when we also add the sigma to terms that have other consonants and the changes that happen, right? The next is the connecting vowel, and this is used for uniting the suffixes or the personal endings to the tense stem. And so we looked at this with present so far and future active and so on. the interesting thing is that when we get to lesson 11, which we're introducing tonight, we'll see with the middle and passive, the perfect, that there isn't going to be a connecting vowel. It's just going to be the ending attached to the verb stem, and that's how it's going to be formed. But with the present, middle and passive, and the future middle and the future passive, we're going to have connecting vowels. Okay? And they'll be the same as before, epsilon and omicron. And the interesting thing is that the connecting vowels also, they can help us distinguish mood. We'll talk more about this when we look at the other chart that I gave you. We saw this before, though. I talked about how in the indicative you're going to primarily find epsilon, omicron, right, and alpha. But if you drop down to the subjunctive, you're going to find that everything's going to be the lengthened vowels of eta or omega. So even in the sense of the connecting vowel, help us to tell us what the mood is, whether it's indicative or whether it's dropped below the line and it's subjunctive and so on. So we'll get more into that, but just let that sort of seed get planted and let it sit there, and we'll water it more as we go along. But just know that even the connecting vowel tells us something. It isn't just merely a device that takes the suffix and enables it to connect to the stem. There is something else that it tells us. And then finally we had the verbal suffix, and this is the termination proper. It serves to distinguish between the tense, voice, person, and number. So we looked at verbs. We started in lesson 8 talking about the verbs. The original verb endings were me, si, ti, men, te, nsi, which came from unti. The tau before the final iota became a sigma, and then liquids and sigmas don't go together, and we saw the change that happened from that. And then the middle form is my, si, tai, metha, essa, ntai. So these are the endings we want to learn now for middle and passive. Whether it's present, future, or perfect, these are our endings. For the aorist and so on, the form will change, but for now, this is what we're looking at. And we saw then the progression in dealing with the language is that there's this commonality that runs all the way through. So put this in English letters so you can better get a sense of the flow of it. But we can see whether we go back to languages within that same family tree and the progression that happens, the endings, we can see it all the way across the board, whether going from primary to secondary, from Indo-European to Sanskrit to Greek. We can see the flow and the progression of carrying these endings on. And we'll see that from the primary then comes the secondary. So when we get to the imperfect and the aorist, we'll see that these endings, for them, develop off of these. So we just keep unfolding, and everything keeps progressing, moving along. It's the same with looking at the issue of everything starting with the aorist or second aorist. We look at things starting with the aorist, then you go to the present, then the perfect. Well, when we talked about tense, we have punctiliar, linear, and then state of completion. You can see that progression where you have the dot, right, punctiliar, linear, the line, and then completion or state of completion, which is the perfect, the dot and the line, right? And so we see this development and movement happening. We see the same thing in the forms. So we have with reduplication, it existed in the aorist into the present, to the future, and it finds itself embedded in the future, and it becomes the primary thing for the future, but then it dies off coming to modern Greek. But we can still see these various progressions happening as we move along. So the forms, although it may seem different, they're not radically different, right? And we can see how we go from the mu to the nu. They're the same, nasal, right? They're nasal, just one is different. One's a bilabial, the other one's an alveolar, right? But we can see the progression of these things. And remember, keep in mind, behind all of this stuff is the phonology, it's the speaking, it's the phonetic aspect of the language. It's not just the writing comes first and then the sound, right? It's the writing to reflect the sound. And so keep those things in mind. So we can walk from the primary tenses all the way through from Indo-European to Sanskrit to Greek to Latin, mi, si, ti, bahami, bahasi, bahati. Then we have primary Greek, same thing, and then carries over into Latin. So here are our primary tense endings. For the active, we saw mi, si, ti, men, te, nsi from nti. And then we have middle and passive, my, si, tai, metha, essa, ntai. And we can even see the development going from mi, si, ti to my, si, tai, right? The relatedness of it. So again, it's not like we're even memorizing completely foreign forms. Like here's one form and then here's a totally different you know, radically different form over here, there's an interrelatedness, and when we look more further on the chart, we'll see the connection that happens. So here's a different chart that I composed for the verbal suffixes. So we have primary suffixes and then secondary. And the first, the primary, deals with present, future, imperfect. The secondary suffixes are the imperfect, the aorist, and the pluperfect. But you can see even here, starting looking at middle and passive, and then over here, right? This is the secondary suffixes, middle and passive. So we have meta, meta, esta, esta, right? Nta, nta. So we can see the connection between all of these elements. So on one hand, we look at it and think, man, it's just a whole bunch of stuff. It's really just certain forms, and they just keep expanding out from that. And once you see that, we see this ta here, this is second person plural, right? Second person plural, second person plural. So when you see these endings, you're just going to know that when you see that, you're going to have that in your mind, right? The te or the the, right? Which is an aspirated, right? Te. Tehe, right? Tehe, all the way through here. So we see the same thing. Active, active, middle and passive, right? We also see the sigma that retains. Here, 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 right? Go to middle and passive, same thing, right? So you just see these connections of these things going through here. When you start to see these things, right, then it makes it easier not only to remember them, but also then to see them in the text. And the same thing with the tau, right? Here, here, even here, and then these two forms here. So it's just like when we looked at the accusative case, you always have that new at the end. When you have the dative, locative, instrumental, right? You always had the iota, but it's a subscript, right? So those little things, when you just, right? Those are just keys, and all of a sudden they'll start connecting for you over time, but just. So we're trying to figure out those simplified, look at those things that really are the things that just, you know, help us lock in, and the other things will flow from there. All right. So these are the primary endings that we're looking for. And this is going to be the focus from here on for the next few weeks, looking at these endings. So mai sai tai, meta este ntai. So active and then middle and passive. And just keep in mind, because then you're going to wrestle with, okay, remember that middle and passive, they share the exact same ending. Okay? Which means that you can have two particular forms have the same form, two verbs have the same form. One can be middle and the other one can be passive. Right? 1 Corinthians 1:18. Right? One is middle, the other one is passive. You're going to have to be able to, like I always say with everything, whether we do etymological study of a word, any of that, you always have to be able to defend it from the context. Context is always the thing. So if you're going to say, well, there's a distinction, they're not both, you know, middle or they're not both passive, then you have to be able to defend that by the context and explain why. But at least know that they can have, both verbs can have the same form, just different significance. And that's really where the tricky element comes. So let's make some verbs in. We'll look through these. So just sort of let this stuff sit. Follow through. We'll just walk through. So primary tense endings for active voice, me, si, ti, mente, and nsi. All right, so here's our, in this case, our root. And we're going to add our endings to these. And we're going to add our connecting vowel, which sometimes referred to as thematic vowel, and that just depending on the grammars that you use, but for convenience we'll call it the connecting vowel. But so essentially, take our endings, we attach it to the stem or to the root. We have the connecting vowel that enables us to do that. Omicron before mu and nu, epsilon before everything else, right? Present active indicative. The me drops out, right? We still have the me verbs, but eventually the me drops out. The omicron then is going to be lengthened to omega, and that becomes our tense stem ending for present active indicative. So when you look in your dictionary in the back of your Greek text or lexicon and so on, the verbs you can find blepo and luo and so on, they're all going to be the O's, right? Except for unless you get to didomi and so on, then they're going to be the me verbs. But those were the original. This is the secondary and developed out of that. Next, when we get to the second person singular, right? Intervocalic sigma drops out. Therefore, we have compensatory lengthening, becomes lue, and then sigma attached to the end of it. So luo, lues, and then tau before a final iota becomes a sigma, right? And then intervocalic sigma, so sigma drops out, right? Compensatory lengthening, right? Lue. So whenever we see that, u or a, we know that there's going to be compensation or contraction. So just keep that in mind whenever we see these. These are not true diphthongs, they're formed because of, and every time we find them, we saw other cases where we found them in other forms, even in our articles, right? Touche from tons. So this is I am loosing, you are loosing, he, she, it is loosing. And again, in that final form, lue, is it he loosed, she loosed, or it loosed? Context will tell you which it is. Then for the plural forms, we have our ending and then our connecting vowel. Our ending, connecting vowel, and our ending, connecting vowel. And the change that happens at the end there, right? Liquids and sigmas don't go together. So the liquid's going to drop out in this case, compensatory lengthening, and we're going to have luusi. So luo, lues, lue, luamen, lute, luusi. So essentially we have we loose, you loose, they loose. And this is just to keep it. Remember, when we talk about present tense, we're not talking about something that's merely here and now. So translate this way, we loose, you loose, they loose. We can say we are loosing, right? Present in time, we're doing this. But for them, keep in mind, present tense is just about continuousness, right? Continuous action, where it's iterated or so on, but think continuous, and then if there's a time element, context will bear that out, but always start with the grassroots of it. So then if we want to make this a future, then we just add the sigma. Luso, luseis, luse, right? I will loose, you will loose, he, she, it will loose. Same thing with the plural form for future active indicative. Again, we're just going to add the sigma to those forms, right? And again, this is just the regular verb, simple. When we get to, the irregular, it gets a little bit tricky, but we'll show it's not as bad as it seems. But nonetheless, these are simple forms. We can recognize these things anywhere. So present, active, future, so on, we should be able to discover these pretty easily in our text. And if we take it further, then we're going to add the perfect active indicative. I have loosed, you have loosed, he, she, it has. So would look at this. I usually translate the perfect stand in the state of having it, so just so I get it in my mind, the full picture of it. Then the nuances of that you work out in the process of studying the context and the word in the context and what's being focused on. Is it more the action that was completed? Is it the result, or so on? So just know that there are different nuances with it, but just usually I start with just stand in the state of being loosed, is how I would translate this if I did it, and then work from there. So we start with our root, in this case, lu. We add our reduplication, right? So we reduplicate the initial consonant. And we add the epsilon, and again, there's that connecting, right? So just as you have a connecting vowel at the end for the suffix, you have the same thing when you have reduplication of that initial consonant. You're going to have a vowel that goes there. In the case of the perfect, you have the epsilon. In the case of the present, right, didomi, we're going to have the iota, right? So that will help us to distinguish between, is this the present or is this, right? Because we might tend to look at it and say, okay, we see reduplication, but then you have to ask, is it a present? Is it perfect? And this will help us discern which one is it. And so here we have reduplication on the front, and then we have our tense stem here, the kappa. We have our connecting vowel, and then our endings. A, as, e, amen, ate, asi. And like I say, for the perfect active indicative, I would just include the alpha along with the kappa as the tense stem. So look for the kappa alpha. Now there are aorist that will have this, but we'll talk about this. You'll be able to distinguish between two, but just to say generally this is for the perfect active indicative, look for that kappa alpha and then the reduplication. So next time we'll look at this is when we form the perfect. Reduplication, we talked about this and some of the changes that come. If you have like an aspirated first consonant, right, then they deaspirate. So, you know, instead of thithe me, right, thithe me, they have tithe me. So we saw those changes happening when we did the reduplication on the front. But if I were going to make this a perfect middle or passive, then I drop the omega and then I'm going to add the ending to it, which would be my, in this case, use as an example, my side tie. So I add the middle and passive ending, but I add it directly to the stem. So there isn't a connecting vowel between the beta and the mu. Okay? So then what happens is we talked about this, the regressive assimilation, right? That the mu is going to cause the other consonant to change and it becomes tetripmai, right? So next time we'll look at this, but that's what the one chart here. Where did I put that? There we go. So this chart here with the consonant changes, this whole chart is all about those changes. So if you want to glance over this and look at some of the examples before we come back next time, that'll help out, but that essentially that's what that chart is looking for. So when we looked at the perfect tense, there are two things that we were concerned with looking at is the reduplication on the front and then what happens at the end when we make changes. Now, the nice thing is because the perfect active, we have the connecting vowel and then the endings. But middle and passive, you just add the ending right to the word and soul. That's where the connection comes from. But again, taking us all the way back to lesson 1, the alphabet, and learning at that, right? All right, so present, future, and perfect, middle, and passive indicative. So lesson 11, if you have that in front of you, most of what we'll look at now is included in your notes there. So if you want to just follow along and keep track there, we'll go back and review, take some thoughts a little bit further, especially when we're coming into talking about the middle voice and passive voice and that. We're going to take the thought of the verb a little bit further tonight, and then we'll come back and look at it later. But for review, we had tense. A character of an action may be defined by either 3 points of view: from action occurring, action continuous, or action completed. Again, always keep going back to these roots. Same thing with the prepositions. Always keeping those roots in mind. And then when you encounter them, right, then you can work out if there's the remote meaning or so on that's being used. But always go back to the root or the core ideas and then work out from that. One, it provides safety for us, especially when it comes to the issue of interpretation, right? We want to be as objective as possible. We want the text to determine, we want the language, the grammar, the syntax, all of that to determine for us what the meaning is. So as much as we can sort of step back from that and just allow it to speak, right, and inform us what to understand, the better off we are. So the more that we can do that, even when it comes to the language of here's the basic idea, here are the root ideas, and then work out from that. Example, when we get to that preposition in, or someone translated by, or so on, is there a legitimate, right, case in which we can translate it that way? So those kinds of things have to be ironed out in the context. The problem is if we get so used to these other sort of remote ideas and then implanting on them that we can do that to a text that we shouldn't be doing it to. So just to say the root ideas, just keep coming back to those and everything flows out of that. Even when we come to the middle and passive voice, there are different ways in which the middle voice can be used. Direct, middle, indirect, so on. So there are all these shades of meanings that come. Just get to the core idea of what the middle is and the passive is, and then you'll learn all those other things as they come along. And that's part of the reason why so far we haven't really spent a whole lot of time delving into all those different nuances, right? Even when we came to the cases, the different ways in which genitive case can be used, right? Subjective, objective, so on. Get the core idea, have that when you go to the text, and then let it formulate out from that, right? Because you're going to have to wrestle with apostle of Christ Jesus. Is it owned by Christ Jesus? Is it sent by Christ Jesus, right? Those things, that's a good part of the process to wrestle with. If we automatically come with that, right, with the possessive apostle belonging to Christ Jesus, we may miss something significant in a passage as we're looking at it. So when we come to the issue of tense and keeping in mind these basic elements, action occurring, and if we take the infinitive form, poiesai, to do, action continuous, poiein, to be doing, or then action completed, to have done. And again, for this, I always just stay in the state of having whatever it may be, right? And then we go on from there. And just to say, so look at, if you look at Colossians, it's interesting. Turn me to Colossians chapter 1, your Greek text. Sorry, my back's on fire. We'll get through this. Colossians 1. And we'll look at verse 16. And this is fun because in Colossians 1:16, we have two different tenses that are used here. In verse 16, we know he's talking about creation, right? So, for in him all things were created, right? Whether in the heavens or on earth, right? Visible, invisible, thrones, dominions, so on. And then he comes at the end of this. And unto him, right? Everything stands in the state of being created. So two different tenses he uses here, built off the same verb. So in the first part of verse 16, ektiste, right? This is aorist passive. Was created, right? Everything was created in him. But notice the end of verse 16, the last word. That's perfect passive. Notice the tie ending, connected straight to the stem. We'll talk about why there isn't reduplication some other time. We looked at this, it's in your notes, but this is perfect passive. So he begins with aorist passive beginning, ends with perfect passive at the end. Two different tenses, two ideas he's communicating using the same verb, right? So just to say, when we're coming through and wrestling with these things in the context, man, the punch of each one of these, right? Some powerful statements that are being made here, knowing to be able to distinguish between this tense, that tense, the significance of this one and that one, right? And what it brings out. It just all of a sudden takes things so much further for us. That's the richness of the language, right? Because sometimes we can have just in an English translation, they can translate them both as sort of this passive, right? Created. And can lose the significance of that. Even at times if we don't know our English language well enough and we have, passive, simple passive, created and then has been created, right? There's something more to that. If we don't know that, we could miss. But if you know in the Greek the distinction of those two, we see that there's a lot being told here. And then it's significant that he ends verse 16 that way with that verb form. And it's perfect. Then he's going to move into verse 17. He's going to talk about the fact that everything stands in the state of being held together. And notice it's going to also be then the perfect. So just to say, keep these root ideas in there. And so think about this then. Okay, action occurring. If we look at the first account in verse 16, in him all things were created, right? It's just punctiliar. Well, it took 6 days to create everything, right? So just keep that in mind, that you can have this statement of fact, but it could have taken, 6 days for it to be accomplished. Or if you have the building of the temple, New Testament, they can express for however many years something took place, they can consolidate it in a single statement of fact they built, right? But it can involve more than that. That's the significance of the aorist. So just keep in mind, it's just a statement of fact. And then however long it took for that to happen or how many people were involved or those kinds of things, the context will bear that out. But again, keep these main points involved. Action occurring, action continuous, and then action completed. And then there are types of tenses. We looked at primary tenses, the unaugmented, the present, the future, the perfect. And then we had the endings that go with these in our chart there. They all share similar endings. And then we have the secondary tenses where we haven't gotten to yet, imperfect, aorist, and then pluperfect. And those will come later. And those we have our own set of endings that we'll need to learn but there is a relatedness between all of them, so we won't be too confused, all right? Another thing by way of review is voice. In Greek, you had voice and tense. Both deal with action, the verb, but from varying perspectives. Tense looks at the kind of action. Voice looks in regards to the subject and the action. So it's more focused on the subject or the doer, right, of the action. And therefore, we have then the personal endings that tell us that. And that's when these things then become very important for us, is these personal endings, because they tell us the involvement in that. And especially when it comes to middle and passive, right? We look at active voice, middle voice, passive voice, and so on. We'll see the significance of what comes out. So lesson 11, in this lesson we're going to cover several things. First, the present, middle, and passive indicative, the future, middle, indicative. We mentioned this, we looked at that chart. So the future, middle, and future passive share the mai, sai, tai, metha, essa, ntai. They share the sigma as the tense stem, but for the future passive, there will be the theta, eta. Now we'll also learn that when we come to aorist passive also has theta, eta. But there are other little clues that will tell us the distinction between them. Okay, so just to know that they will share that ending. But again, the mai, sai, tai, metha, essa, ntai, those endings will be for future, middle, and passive. And then we have the perfect, middle, and passive indicative. So originally, I used to deal with each one of these separately. But then I decided, you know what, they all share these endings. There's so many common elements. When we talk about middle voice and passive voice, it's the same. Whether it's the present, the future perfect, there's this similarity in all of that. So why isolate them all and fragment them out? Why not just look at them comprehensively as far as what they share together? And so that's one of the ways in which I've reduced the length of the grammar and everything down, is that I've taken things and combined them where they're related. That way it's a little bit even easier for us as we're learning the certain things that we need to learn, of being able to sort of pigeonhole everything and put it in its box if we're not so far spread out from each other. And oftentimes when they're dealt with in total, isolation from each other, even in grammars when they're split up, which can also lead to further confusion and not realizing what's going on. So we're going to deal with them all together, and again, they all share these exact same middle and passive endings together. So some of the things we want to look at, just quickly, we'll come to an end here, but we're going to look at first the verbs revisited, then voice reiterated, and then voice developed. Just some things that we need to understand when we come into lesson 11 and deal with these, the present, the future, and the perfect. So in your notes there for lesson 11, if you want to look and follow with me, we'll just walk through these. The first is that verbs introduced previously in lesson 8. Our understanding needs to be taken a little bit further at this point, especially in light of the verb and its relation to voice. And we'll get into the different functions of middle and passive a little bit later. I've done this sort of as a part of Greek class in the past. When I've done it, I just sort of did sort of like an added extra thing that I covered just to show, highlight and stuff. Just don't want to confuse anyone and overwhelm anyone with all the different ways the middle voice can be used, right? There's no point in getting all bogged down with that. But there are some things that we need to understand. So grammatically speaking, the verb is a part of the sentence which affirms action or state of being. And the verbal idea can be looked at from a number of different perspectives. So we can look at the verbal idea as it relates to the object, transitive or intransitive, or the verbal idea as it relates to the subject, i.e. then voice. And we'll look at these two aspects. And I'm just going to plant these seeds, think on it, transitive, intransitive, and all that, and the significance of that, and keep that in mind. And we come back next time, we'll look at the different types of middle voice in that. But dealing with the verbal idea as to the object, transitive. A verb is transitive when it needs an object to complete its meaning. So example, he built. This is transitive because it needs an object. There's something it has to complete it. He built what, right? It leaves you with a question. You need something answered. And so it isn't sufficient in of itself. There has to be an object added to it. So he built a house. That completes the idea, and now we have some meaning here, right? We're not left hanging. So that is essentially transitive, is that it carries an action and it brings it over, and there has to be an object on which it rests upon. He built something. Got to put something in there. Built a house, built a car, built a mess, whatever you want to do with it, but there's got to be some sort of object there, okay? And this is an oversimplification, but just to say, just keep these thoughts in mind, and when we come into the rest of this lesson, as you preview it for next time and read through the other examples going through, just keep these thoughts in mind because they'll help you understand a little bit more how the verb functions. And again, we're trying to understand things from a grammatical aspect, but also from Greek mindset. What was in their mind when they used the language? When I learned Russian, it was tough because one sense it was easier for me because I learned Greek and knew Greek, so it was easier to pick up the language in one sense because there's so much similarity. But English, we have our set form. We have the set pattern that we have, subject, verb, object, right? And so you follow that same pattern, although there can be things you added to that, variation, but it's essentially we follow that same route. Well, then all of a sudden you get to Russian, and you can be like Greek, you can move things around depending on emphasis. So I had to think in my mind, okay, this is what I want to say in English, right? Now where's my emphasis? Okay, and then I have to figure that out. Then I have to translate over into Russian and say, okay, here's my emphasis, and then here's how everything builds into that, right? And so we had friends of ours that came, and they moved into a region outside of Novosibirsk. They went further into Russia. They went down by the Mongolian border. And where we were, there were young people who went to the universities and stuff like that, so they were learning English. They wanted to practice, which was nice. And then you got to use your English a lot. And so there was that benefit to it. Well, where they went, everyone was speaking Russian or their native tongue. But for the most part, Russian was that common language everyone spoke. And so all of a sudden they went from being able to use English to not using it at all, and now having to. So the first time they came back to visit us, both of them, they just look haggard. They look beat up, they look worn out, and they just needed a rest. And just to be able to speak English and to say the things you wanted to say, the way you wanted to say them, was such a huge relief to them, you know? And so just to say, we get ourselves in the mindset as much as we can with this, but realize that there are some differences, and we want to keep that in mind when we get into this. And as much as we can think with a bit of a Greek mindset, the better off we'll be when we come to dealing with the things in language, especially middle voice, because like I say, that really can't be carried over to English that well. So then it's figuring out, okay, well, what's an idiom that we can use that best represents what's there? So an intransitive then, an intransitive verb is one in which needs no object to complete its meaning. So we have he ran, could be considered complete and therefore needs no object. He didn't need to run anywhere, he ran. And that can, it's simple, yes it's simple, but you get the point of what the difference is between transitive and intransitive. Then the verbal idea to the subject in regards, we could have he killed or he was killed. The focus is not upon the object but on the subject, right? So either he killed or he was killed. One is active, the other one is passive, right? Both of these pertain to voice. So killed is the same in both of these, right? So that's the thing that gets a little bit confusing, because voice, it really isn't focusing on the action. It's focusing on the subject in relation to that action. But the problem is, and you have active and passive. Both of these imply action, right? And so it helps foster the confusion that we have coming into to learn Greek from an English mindset, trying to understand the language. So just sort of keep that in mind, is that in both of these cases, killed is the same, right? The focus is on the subject, he did this, or he was, right? One active, one passive. Voice reiterated then, as mentioned previously in Greek, both voice and tense deal with action, the verb, but from two varying perspectives. Again, tense is dealing with kind of action. Voice is dealing with the subject in relation to that action. So we can have active voice, we looked at before, middle voice, and then passive voice. The parent speech had two voices, an active and a mediopassive, and the later is represented by the Greek Sanskrit middle, a type common to Greek and Indo-Iranian, with relics in both branches. So here's what's interesting. It's taken from Buck. So you're going to find that, so we look at the endings and say, okay, my side, type, method, same type, they share the exact same. Well, active has its own ending, but now you have middle and passive, they share the exact same. You'll find that the reason is because of not only the parent language, but the other languages involved. So Robertson makes a statement that the passive is known to be a later development. In other words, it seemed that looking at the language that the middle voice was used, but then they had these two nuances in which it was used, and then all of a sudden it developed into a passive usage, right? So keep that in mind when we look at the languages that, so the middle voice is that he did this, right, to himself, right? But then you have just a statement that it happened to him. And once that you have the subject doing it and the result comes back on him, he loosed himself from the ropes, right? Or he was loosed from the ropes, then we have the passive form. We can see this progression in the development, the movement from the middle to the passive, but just keep that in mind when we start looking at the nuances of both of them used in context. You'll see that there is the sense of relatedness, but earlier on that was started off with the middle voice and then the passive developed all that, and hence the shared endings, essentially, right? So apart from the use of the middle voice in passive sense, there were no distinct passive forms, and the passive developed independently in the various tongues. So each language then essentially makes the passive in its own way, with some languages never developing a passive. So they just found other ways to express the idea without developing a different form by itself or standing by itself or expressing that. They just found different ways to use the middle to make a passive, present a passive significance. So there's no question, however, that the active and middle voices are very old and long antedate the passive. So again, understanding the grassroots, moving out from that, the reason for the shared forms, but then we'll find that there is some variation that comes. It's like when you look at the cases, so you have the dative, locative, and instrumental all share the same ending, right? They share the same form. So then you have some grammars that say it's just the dative, right? It's just the dative case. And then they have, you know, however they want to develop that. But the problem is they end up saying, well, it's the pure dative, and then it's the instrumental dative, and then the locative dative. You end up, when you start wrestling with text, realizing that there are nuances to that. So you can't just say it's the dative, right? There are at least 3 different usages of that dative. You can hang on to that. So you find that guys who learned in New Zealand and Australia, you'll find they'll say dative, then they'll say pure dative, right? Locative dative, instrumental dative. But then when you come to the U.S., then you'll have just the 3 distinct elements, right? But either way you look at it, you still have to acknowledge that there are these nuances that happen. So same thing when we come to middle and passive. And I just say that because you'll encounter stuff. So I even read stuff and they'll say it's a dative, and I'm like, it's not, it's locative, right? It's talking about location. It's using preposition in, right? It's location, it's in something, it's, you know, but they'll call it dative. So just keep that in mind. So if you read other, you know, exegetical works, commentaries, right, that deal with the language, you'll get that terminology. Just know, right, that there is nuance there, and you just have to be aware of that. But so to introduce that, but that's just a part of the development of what happens. The same thing with middle passive. So essentially, this is why they both share the same ending. There was that middle. Passive was a later development. Some languages didn't have that. But with the Greek, we have those distinctions, but the form is exactly the same. And then the context, then again, is where we find out which is which and how that is supposed to look when we translate it and then interpret it. Voice developed, then we have the function active voice. The active voice, simply stated, describes the subject as producing the action or representing a state expressed by the verbal idea. This is the simplest form. When we come across it, this is easy for us. So we can just sort of like say, okay, active voice, yeah, this, just put it off to the side. This is where we're going to wrestle, is really getting our minds wrapped around the middle voice. And I'll just say that in general, we talked about this, and generally when it comes to the verb, we really have to try and grasp the Greek mindset with the verb. When it comes down to dealing with voice, this is where we're going to have to really wrestle with, is understanding middle voice and the significance of what it is. So Dana and Manny make this statement. Here we approach one of the most distinctive and peculiar phenomena of the Greek language. It is impossible to describe it adequately or accurately in terms of English idiom, for English knows no approximate parallel. It is imperative that the student abandon as far as possible the English point of view and comprehend that of the Greek. And again, just say this because, you know, sometimes you hear guys preaching and they'll say something, you're going, that's not really true. And if I look at it in the context, not really so. Part of it is you should just realize it's because of their being taught Greek with an Americanized approach, right? And therefore, they're missing some significant aspects and elements, and they're just bringing what they've learned and just imposing it on that, and not realizing, there's just a different way that you need to be looking at it, right? So just that to say is that when we start dealing with middle voice, you know, you're going to read works and commentators and stuff like that, just to have a great sense of what that basic idea is, and then read them with caution, but always weighing it by the original idea. The middle voice was used for actions in which the subject was intimately concerned, more than as merely the doer. So although the focus is on the subject, it was more than just their doing the action, right? He killed, right? That's just the simple doer of the deed. But when we come to middle voice, several thoughts are involved here, and just say even these are just basic, but again, there's just different nuances that come. One, what did to oneself, what one does for oneself, right? Or what one does with one's own possessions, all right? So we can start to see the different nuances that unfold from the middle voice. One felt oneself, right? And all of a sudden we become, you know, introspective and you know, subjective in our reflections. So just to say, these are just elements, basic elements that are involved in the middle voice. So if you get these senses down, but again, we look at that God chose us for himself. There was an invested interest. Well, it tells us a lot, right? That he wanted to have a relationship with me, right? I mean, if you pull out the meaning of that, right? Unto the adoption as sons. Well, you can see just a beautiful picture of all of that taking place. But then realizing he didn't have to do that. That was just his choice to do that by his grace, unmerited favor, all this stuff. So just to say, man, there's just so much meaning to unpack from that, right? But just start to get your mind wrapped around just the basic ideas first, and then wrestle with what comes out of that. And I just say, even with the last one, number 4, well, one felt oneself. Some of those statements that are made in reference to the religious leaders and the response to Christ and that, go back and look at those sometime and just ponder. I mean, the form that are used, but the thought process and the thoughts that are being expressed there. Some amazing thoughts. And again, the translations won't cover that. The translations don't bear these things out, right? So at least we have to have these things in our head when we're going through these passages. The Sanskrit had only only had active and middle forms, and the Hindu grammarians refer to the active as the parasmi or parasmaipadan, word for another, while the middle they refer to as the word for oneself. So even when we look at that, we get a sense of that idea, right? Word for one's self. So even when we look at the various languages, even the idea is still there, right? Now, what's interesting is that when we look at some passages of Greek, we'll find that you can have sort of that middle voice reflected a different way. You can have an aorist tense with the preposition eis and then say auton. So he did this unto himself. Or so it can have that reflexive voice. So you don't always have to have the middle voice used, right? So just to keep that in mind, there are different ways to express these ideas. But then when you come to the middle, what is the significance of that? There's some sort of involved interest with the subject and what was taking place in the action. So it isn't merely just the doer. So in regards to the middle voice, the subject rather than the action is brought into view. The essence lies in calling attention to the agent, in some way clearly concerned with the action. Strictly speaking, the middle voice is used without some sort of reference to the subject. It's not used without some sort of reference to the subject. Somehow they're involved in whatever takes place. Passive voice is relatively easy for us to understand. Active voice is super simple for us to understand. It's that middle that's going to cause us some quandary. But if we get a sense of what's going on and then work out from that, we'll be good. So next time we'll come back and we'll look at, I'll just give you some different ways in which the middle voice can be used, and then the passive, and then we'll talk about the formation of these different forms, present, future, and then perfect. If you want to look on page 5 of lesson 11, give you the example from luamai, lue, luetai, and then we have for the perfect, we have lelumai. And again, notice that the ending is attached straight to the stem. There is no connecting vowel. So in one sense, it's pretty simple, but there are some changes when you add that suffix to a word that ends with a consonant. And so we'll talk about those next time. So we'll look at the formation of these particular forms and then talk a little bit more about what the function is of them. Questions? Any? I'm sure you have plenty more.